Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the BannedBooks podcast episode. What is the episode number?
106 and maybe 107.
106 and maybe 107.
It seems like we're doing that habitually now. So
we have, for those of you who don't know, because you're not doing behind the scenes, we used to record twice a week to get the 2 episodes out, and then with Bonhoeffer and Saze, we just kind of...
Well, we tried to tackle a little bit more, a longer text, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so rather than divide it up artificially and trying to pick up the conversation down, a couple days later, we just kind of have the conversation.
And then divide it up artificially.
And then divide it up artificially in post. So you don't have to.
There you go.
But, yeah. Thanks for everything that you do to support the podcast in 1517. And today, then, we're going to dive into another Second World War era pastor theologian. And as we've discussed, this takes place during the Nuremberg trials, actually, with a Lutheran chaplain. You want to do some background on him since it's your book? Yeah,
I will. Lutheran pastor from he was from Illinois, I think, or maybe Missouri, but he was in that St. Louis area in the 30s. And then when he was 50, he enlisted in the Army in 1943. His two sons had already enlisted, older sons had enlisted at that point. Then he did as well, and ended up being a chaplain then for the Army. And ended up in London, I think. Yeah, he was serving in London until the war ended. And then when the war ended and the Nuremberg trials started, I should say, the Catholic chaplain working in Nuremberg specifically asked that he come and minister to the Protestant, folks. We would say Lutherans, and then probably Reformed, and whoever else was non-Catholic. Right. Yeah. Non-Roman Catholic.
Right.
So, so he was like middle-aged, actually, when he enlisted and served as chaplain, although he had done like hospital chaplaincy stateside before that, so had some experience with that.
It would, since we're on this tangent, I'm thinking about it, something that we could definitely then build off of this episode with, and I think it would be helpful for our listeners, because I know in my experience, this book shows up in a lot of church libraries, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And the reason I bring it up is because Frankl survived the death camps.
Oh, okay.
And Man's Search for Meaning came about as his reflection after the fact in about this time period, the Nuremberg trials, and then later he wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning. But it is the question of evil.
Yeah.
And on morals too, because Frankl then, on the Jewish side of things, is asking and said himself that the worst of us walked out of those camps because we were the ones who were willing to do what was necessary to survive, whereas those who stood on their beliefs and their principles died rather quickly. And Hannah Arendt famously, talked about the banality of evil based on the Nuremberg trials. Of what we're going to cover here is these supposed monsters, these Nazi, especially the prison camp and the death camp commandants and guards. You meet them and they were so normal. They were hyper intelligent. They were usually upper middle class. They came from good families. They were well educated. They were articulate. They were intellectuals. And yet they didn't have a problem morally or spiritually, as we'll talk about, with exterminating an entire race of people. What do you do with that?
Well, and this chaplain, Gerecke, he said, because he had a diary, and he also was interviewed by his son, and then his grandson's the guy who wrote the book that we're going to read from. He said that I don't think anybody really realized the magnitude of what the German hierarchy did. When the war ended, we just didn't know a lot of it. Then you started reading 30,000 killed on this page, 40,000 on the next page.
Right.
And that was all happening in the midst of then trying to provide some spiritual care to these men who were responsible for it, which, I mean, that's a different way of facing evil, isn't it? That the evil's put before you and evil men, and yet they're asking to speak to a chaplain.
And I would say a majority of even Christians, let alone people, would argue that they don't deserve that. A chaplain. And it makes me reflect, the term, your name is mud. That term comes from the doctor who took care of John Wilkes Booth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he himself, his life was ruined because of that. But what is he like he said at the time, he's like, I'm a doctor, what am I supposed to do? He was brought to me with a bullet wound, and I was told to fix him up. And so the term, your name is, if you don't do this, your name's going to be mud. That's because this guy's name, he was destroyed, and his name became
dragged through the mud. Yeah.
Yeah, it became a catchphrase for everything that is wrong and vile, because it's like, how dare you doctor the assassin who murdered our president? And it's like, but I'm a doctor and I took an oath to do no harm. And I have read articles, for example, by more recent doctors in Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters are brought to them. And there's a soldier right here, and then on the other side of the curtain is a Taliban fighter, and they as a doctor are faced with this moral dilemma of, well, what do I do? Well, my heart says, my brain says, my training says, I'm obviously going to attend to the American soldier first, and if the Taliban fighter dies, he dies. But then once I do attend to this fighter, because it's my job, and this person survives, and I know when they walk out the front door, they're going to go up into the mountains and start firing RPGs back at this camp. What do you do with that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I guess I would argue also, though, that unless you've done it, you've been there, then maybe shut up and don't be so quick to judge somebody.
Well, I think there's a way that we dehumanize the enemy, right? We act as if they're acting. Yeah. I mean, certainly their actions, we're talking about Nazi war criminals or the Afghans. I mean, it does
morally, it's a pretty clear line.
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly, they have no respect for humanity, or at least very little. And yet they have respect for their own humanity. I mean, these men, they have families, they have children,
right? But this also didn't occur in a vacuum. It's like the book Ordinary Men about the Polish camp guards they were German policemen. They were moral men. They were family men. They were chosen because of their sense of justice and right.
Yeah.
And yet within a year, they're shooting pregnant women out in a field in the back of the head because they're not human, And so likewise, and you see this now currently in our culture in 2019 or 2020, I got to make that transition still. But in 2020, you have people on social media actually victim blaming, like they're arguing in favor of Iran against the United States. Although Iranians aren't doing that currently because they're in the middle of almost a revolution.
Yeah, right.
But at least in the United States, they're doing that. And as I've learned in my life too, we can say, but it's our fault because in 1979, we propped up the Shah. And then you can say, well, it's the British fault or it's their fault. And
how recursive do you want to be? Yeah.
Right. And like with German nationalism, and I've recently, last year, I read a book called Bushido by Inazu Notobe on the Warrior Priest podcast. He was simply presenting a book to the West explaining Bushido, the way of the samurai and the samurai warrior code. And then the Japanese government seized upon that and used that to basically propagate Japanese nationalism, which led to eventually the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, are we going to blame Notobe for his book on the samurai ethic on Bushido when it was twisted and perverted by the Japanese government? Likewise, like I pointed out, the German military did not surrender at Versailles. The politicians did.
Right.
And so that in and of itself fomented the kind of attitude of the German military, which included guys like Hitler and Goering and Goebbels and others, to say, we got to turn things around. We got to get revenge. Now, is that the Brits and the French and the Americans' fault then because of the way that they structured the peace treaty at Versailles to punish the German people? Like, do we blame Wall Street for the Depression in the 20s? Like, what do we do? Like, how far do you want to go with this before we simply take a person as they are and go, okay, but what about you? What choices did you make? It's like, as a pastor, since we're going down this rabbit hole, as a pastor and as a recovering addict, at some point you have to ask the question, okay, but what choices have you made that brought you to this point? Stop blaming your parents for your addiction. Stop blaming other people for your addiction. Stop blaming circumstances out of your control for your addiction. Take ownership and responsibility for the choices you made,
right? That
you're now at bottom or you're in recovery.
Well, I'd say the operative words that you said are within your control. There's so much that's outside of your control. You can't change history. You can't change your past.
Right.
You can't change what was done to you.
Right.
Right. You can respond to it.
Exactly. You can choose how to respond to it. That's Epictetus's famous maxim. Like, I can't control what happens to me, but I can control how I choose to react.
Well, and I think that's the case with this chaplain in particular, right? I mean, he's got these men before him. They're not going to be able to retract, the death camps, Dachau or something, right?
Right.
I mean, they can't change what they've done. And that's what goes into pastoral care is, one, admitting their failure, right? Being brought to repentance by God's word, but also like, how are you going to respond to this? Well, obviously they're going to hang, which is out of their control as well. I mean, that's going to be an external sentence to them. So all they can do is say, let's deal with what God has to say about this.
Right.
Right. Because their neighbors have already, they've already been tried. They've already been sentenced. They're going to hang. And
right. And that's a question too, right? And we'll definitely have to confront this at some point in the conversation when we read this is we often joke about being forgiveness dispensers as Lutheran pastors. However, what if anything does repentance play in the absolution? And if one is not repentant, especially on this level, where it's so clearly not only immoral but a spiritual evil because of the cult of Nazism and the cultic aspects that Hitler built into Nazism, it's not simply it's not a matter of just virtue. Yeah. It's actually a spiritual matter too. This is false worship. This is satanic.
Yeah. It was.
Like we were talking about before we went on air, what happens when Satanism is simply the culture?
Well, I made the argument when we were talking about it before that it's always been that way. There's actually, what was called Satanism, like say in the 70s, 80s,
Yeah. That was adorable Satanism.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was
LARPing.
It was a branding.
It was for sure.
Yeah.
Having been a child who listened to heavy metal and played Dungeons and Dragons and whose parents worried because 60 Minutes and others were scaring parents into believing that Judas Priest and
AC/DC
Dungeons and Dragons was going to drive me to Satanism and suicide. My mother would always, now, that's not real. I'm like, what? Wizardry is not real, Mom? Really? Like,
yeah, and video games are going to make you violent.
Yes, exactly.
As if you weren't violent already.
Right, exactly. Wait, I need permission to be this way? Yeah, no, Satanism in the 80s and late 70s. Well, if you look at movies, for example, and TV shows from the 70s, Satan was a very popular, and Satanism was a very popular subject in the 70s.
Oh, yeah, you think of like The Exorcist.
The Exorcist. There were a lot of B movies that, like Rosemary's Baby, which was technically the end of the 60s.
But I would say even like the really popular, horror movies. I mean, it's trying to confront
the
evil.
Omen. Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't like in the 50s, for example, early 60s, where the evil was this creature or this irradiated insect or the blob or the 50-foot woman. But in the 70s, it was Satan or the son of Satan, like in Omen, for example.
Right.
But it was Satanism. And like we were talking about, we love to pretend like, well, back then it was this way, but it's not that way now.
No.
That way we don't have to confront the ugly reality of just society and people in general.
Well, I think we like to personify evil.
Yes.
Because it's easy to point the finger or it's easy to name. But what do you do when it becomes this nameless, just banal evil, right? Where it's just, it's so enculturated that it's just assumed that that's just how things are.
Right. Well, and then what part does society play in creating these monsters? Again, yesterday I was reminded, listening to a conversation, Ted Krasinski, the Unabomber. Yeah, he was a part of the LSD experiments.
Oh.
Like they gave him heroic.
How many people were involved in the LSD?
Right. Well, Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary. He was loaded up with heroic doses for like 77 days in a row or something with LSD.
That has to change your mind. Yeah,
it does tend to alter one's perception of reality. And so then after the fact, we're like, oh, I mean, this guy's a monster. He's sending. Okay, someone created him. That's the thing. Someone created him. A society created that person. And like I said, you can walk that back and blame the CIA and MK Ultra in the 50s and blah, 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 and start wearing a tinfoil hat and living out in the woods in a cabin like he did. Or you can just say, yeah, but you still chose to do this. And do we socially have a responsibility, even within a congregation, do we as congregations have responsibilities to our people, to our Christian brothers and sisters to say, hey, this doesn't seem right, or why are you saying that? Or because you and I both, I'm sure, encountered this. I mean, you had the UFO guy in your congregation.
That's right. Yeah.
And you encounter things as pastors where you think to yourself, well, that's just tinfoil hat guys on YouTube. And then they they come to your church and you're like, huh.
Well,
I did not see that coming.
And the point was with the UFO guy, who's now deceased, may he rest in peace, but he ended up with cancer. It led him away from faith. It was drawing him away from Christ.
That's my point. Yes, exactly. It leads you away from Christ. It's like the apocalyptic people that come to church, where they're convinced that, it's like, hey, did you get your MREs? I'm like, what? They're like, yeah, Alex Jones is having a sale on MREs this week. I'm like, I'm not tracking.
You didn't build your bunker yet.
I did not build my bunker yet. Exactly. Because World War III, it's coming for the 5th time in 4 years, apparently.
Maybe.
And it's literally the 5th time that we've been told that World War III is right around the corner in 4 years.
By people who have no concept of World War II or I.
Correct. Yes. As I point out to my children, no veteran that I know who has any actual on-the-ground experience is talking the way that the media is talking right now.
Yeah. No.
Because they know better.
Right.
And so, all of this, I think, is the mix when we start talking about chaplaincy and ministering to people, especially, like I said, it's pretty easy to say of a guy like Goering, who in his personal life, we don't have to go into this, you can read David Irving's biography of him, and there's other biographies, but Goering had he had an open secret, and he really liked silk and cashmere in women's shoes. I'll leave it at that.
I'll link to the Wikipedia.
He had appetites.
Wikipedia bio, which does go into the details.
And again, a lot of the top Nazi brass, they were amphetamine and coke addicts, and they had their own little quirks. But in my experience as a pastor, those who are hell-bent on dehumanizing others are wrestling with some pretty serious stuff in their personal life privately, which is why they are trying to displace responsibility onto others.
Right.
Like you and I have encountered, both personally and professionally, when someone comes in and says, well, that's a sin and you shouldn't be doing that, you're sinning, repent, the harder they come at you with that one thing that they just can't let it go. And you check yourself and ask, am I really, is it really, am I just blind to this? And you check in with your elders or other people and they're like, no, I'm not seeing that. You have to ask yourself then a follow-up question. Why are you so adamantly attacking this thing about me that other people just are not recognizing or seeing, and I'm not either?
Right.
Like, what is it about this particular sin that has got you so rung up? And in my experience, a lot of times it's because that's the thing they're wrestling with themselves.
Yep.
Yeah. So just keep that in your pocket for the next time you see something horrible. As far as, people blaming others for, sin. So let's dive into the book. What's the name of this book again? Wine and Blood? Is that the chapter
Mission
of the book?
at Nuremberg. Yes.
Mission at Nuremberg.
Wine and Blood. And page 258, starting there.
Awesome. So the prisoners began to hear the sound of hammering. Spear was irritated at first, thinking someone was carrying out repairs at night. Then it dawned on him what was happening. Several times I thought I heard a saw. And then there came a pause. Finally, several hammer blows, he wrote in his diary. After about an hour, complete silence returned. Lying on my cot, I could not shake off the thought that the executions were being prepared. Sleepless, unquote. Tillis's team did most of the gallows assembly on October 15. The executions would take place in the gym. The team blacked out the windows and hung a long black curtain from the basketball hoop to obscure 11 coffins before finishing the gallows. They were told to stay within the confines of the Palace of Justice until they received their final instructions at 11 p.m. As Tillis's team worked, the chaplains went from cell to cell on the ground floor, sitting with each man for a few minutes, listening as they quote-unquote unburdened their hearts, Gerecke later wrote, because they felt they were soon to go into eternity. So right then and there, here are these chaplains going cell to cell in this school.
Yeah.
Where the gallows, the nooses, are being hung in the gym on the basketball court.
So you're talking to these men while they hear the hammers.
Yeah.
And the saws. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like funeral preaching then, right? I mean, there's
100%.
You've got a very real situation that you're preaching in the midst of.
Right. Well, and what struck me too is he describes this in the same way that a death row chaplain would describe someone going to be, lethally injected or electrocuted or something like that.
Yeah. What do you want on your tombstone?
This is on death row. They're on death row.
Yeah.
So then, like you were saying, and I was saying, we accuse them of being monstrous and dehumanizing others, and then we engage in the same behavior. Which reminds me of Marcus Aurelius' famous dictum, if you don't want to become like, the best revenge is to not become like your enemy. And yet, what is the easiest thing in the world but to become exactly like our enemy?
Right. And you and I like maybe the darker fare of, comedy and film and whatnot. I'm not a big horror fan, but I do like the psychological dramas and the way that
my favorite horror movie is Office Space.
That's hilarious. No, but thinking about our own capacity for evil. If we were in this situation, I know it's hypothetical and it's impossible to actually consider. Realistically anyway, but to say, are we capable of the same sort of behavior? How close are we to, a totalitarian, government? Would we go along with this sort of behavior if we were in that situation? And, would we look the other way? And we do. I mean, this is the honest appraisal of our culture. We're talking about the demonic, being at work amongst us. It's like 42 million children were killed in the womb last year, and we look the other way. Worldwide. That's worldwide. That's not just U.S. And that's an estimate. We don't even know for sure.
Right.
42 million people died. I mean, that's genocide. That's worse than genocide. I don't even know what that is. I mean, it's xenophobia.
And that's a year, though. That's 1 year.
That's 1 year.
Yeah.
1
Add
year.
it up.
Yeah. And you say, well, we're not capable of what the Nazis did. And they're like, really? I mean, how honest are you being here?
I was going to say, where was eugenics perfected? I should say they may have perfected eugenics, but where was it proposed and formulated?
Well, I mean, their fault is that they did it too fast and too hard. They just went after it so quickly. Didn't give people enough time to kind of come around to their way of thinking.
Right. Exactly. No, 100%. And for those, again, after the fact, like you said, it's easy to conduct a kind of revisionist history, but Nazism was very popular in the 20s and 30s in the United States.
Yeah. We talked about that.
Like I've said before, where I grew up at, you would go to estate sales and you'd find lots of Nazi memorabilia, and it wasn't from guys who served in Europe in the war.
No.
They were actually Nazis at some point. But where I grew up at on the Iron Range in northeastern Minnesota, there are a lot of communists. Yeah. In fact, in Gilbert, Minnesota, there's a museum to an entire generation of folks who were convinced to go over to Russia for land and then weren't allowed to leave once they got there.
Well, I mean, Nazi has become like a bad word or an insult, but there are aspects of, I suppose, of that movement that I think we're probably sympathetic to, like circling the wagons and nationalism in kind of a broad sense. I mean, we have that. Of course, it's, United States of America, go America. It's a little bit different, but also like, let's band together, for the sake of, correcting some injustice or, for economic benefit or whatever it is. To just demonize the whole movement is to fail to see how appealing it was. Right, exactly. And not appealing necessarily to myself, again, morally or spiritually, but rather to take an objective view and stand outside the house and look through the window and say, well, how did you guys buy? Like, how did you accept all this? And like we talked about with Saze, when you have a person who comes along who says, I can fix the economy, right? You're down with that. Now, if he had said, I want to fix the economy by committing genocide, you would have said, whoa, what? Versus, first, I'm going to put food back on the table and get you working. I'm going to give you pride just in yourself as a man, for example. I'm going to give back your family. I'm going to give back the schools. I'm going to give back the roads and the industry and so forth and so on. And then, piece by piece, I'm going to start to identify the problems. Right. What led us to this place? Well, and maybe the seeds were there, but the actual agenda, I don't know that it was as spelled out at the beginning as it ended up being at the end. Right. I imagine they said, well, yeah, while we agree with what we did, on the other hand, we didn't see it coming either. I mean, we just kind of went with what came next, right? What seemed to be the next step, and that's where we went. But, was it super strategic? I'm not so sure. Systematic, institutionalized, strategic. Yeah, I'm sure there was a loose outline that eventually became this final solution. Right. Yeah. Right. But, usually, at least in my experience in groups, most guys in a group, this goes for like gangs and stuff like that, or when you're out socially and, one guy has had a little bit too much to drink and thinks that you looked at his girl the wrong way. Most of the guys in that group, they're just out having a good time, goofing around, being guys. They don't want to start a fight with anybody. And maybe they talk a little smack to themselves, but they wouldn't like shout across the room. Right. Then there's the one guy who's always ready for the fight, but never starts the fight. And then there's the guy who starts fights. And as long as that guy's there and the guy next to him who's ready to fight
and he knows that guy's right there, the other people will just follow.
That's called a mob.
It's a mob. But all you need is the one guy in the group. Everyone's like, what should we do? I'm like, maybe we should just like make it illegal for Jewish people to own businesses. And, maybe we should just pay, Jews have to pay like higher taxes. And then that one guy's like, let's kill them all. And everyone's like, whoa, that was aggressive. And he's like, no, hear me out. And then by the end of the argument, everyone's like, well, he does have a point.
I think this might work.
And if Hitler is in the room and Hitler's like, I like the idea, everyone else at the table is going, well, if Hitler likes the idea, I can't disagree with Hitler. Again, so many people that joined the Nazi party in the universities in Germany, they weren't down with the Nazi ideology, but for the sake of self-preservation, they wore the brown shirts. Mm-hmm. Right. How many people, and like, I ministered to this woman. I ministered to a woman who's a member of the Hitler Youth. Wow. She was a wonderful old lady, and she had great stories, obviously, because her mother would read from books of the Bible that didn't exist to teach her kids moral lessons. But she explained it. She's like, I was a member of the Hitler Youth because that's the only way that you got food ration cards.
Huh, yeah.
So her family sent all of their kids to join the Hitler Youth and march and do all the things because, well, that's how you get food.
And maybe it makes sense then after a while. You just kind of go along with it. Because
like she said, I didn't have any grant. Like she's like, she said, we weren't really, like they would teach us, they would catechize us at church, by the way, in Sunday school. This is how they did it.
Right.
To your point. No, I completely forgot about her. That in Sunday school, that's what you were taught is Nazi ideology from the Bible, from the catechisms and the Sunday school materials. But as she said, most of the stuff that we were taught that was from the Bible wasn't actually even in the Bible. But it was in the materials for the Sunday school, for example.
Wow.
And so when you grow up from the littlest to then adolescence and then middle school, gymnasium, being taught this stuff, and by the way, there's no internet. There's no way for you to go outside of this bubble to find out whether or not what you're being taught in church on Sunday is the same everywhere. You just assume like she said, you just assume everybody learns this stuff in Sunday school.
Right.
It's only after the war. By the way, she was hired as a secretary by the Allies in 1945. A lot of the Hitler Youth, the Nazi youth, were put to work for the Allied powers when they came into Germany.
So you're talking about, at least a generation of lead up here.
Yeah.
And like you called it catechization. I think that's right. They're being taught the ideology. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's kind of like, boiling the frog or something.
Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so back to the book then. That morning, Andrus had summoned Gerecke and O'Connor to his office.
O'Connor's the Catholic chaplain, by the way.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously.
The last name wasn't a tip-off. Mm-hmm. He told them the condemned men would be awakened at 11:45 p.m., served a last meal, and then walked to the gym. The executions would begin just after midnight. Andrus had ordered the chaplains not to tell the men, nor anyone else, of the execution plans. They should not know until they were woken up that night, he had told them. The day should proceed normally. Whew. In the afternoon, as the chaplains visited the men's cells, O'Connor asked Kaltenbrunner, Frank, and Seyss-Inquart whether they would like to confess their sins and receive communion. Their eyes grew large as they realized why he was asking. What did he know? They demanded. Would it happen at dawn tomorrow?
Yeah, that's called last rites. Right,
yeah. O'Connor told them he had not heard anything. Gerecke sat with each of the 6 condemned men in his charge, Goering, Keitel, Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, Saukel, and Frick, and delivered a copy of a devotion he had written in German for them. He asked them each to join him in a prayer that he had also written. Only Rosenberg refused. No, please do not, he said to Gerecke. Goering demanded to know what was going on with the execution timetable. He was also refusing to leave his cell, and he was adamantly against exercising or showering. He took all the family photos that had decorated his flimsy table and put them in an envelope for this attorney. In the early afternoon, Goering requested a visit from Gerecke. What time are the executions scheduled for, Pastor? Goering asked. Gerecke did not answer. The Reichsmarshal was a likable man. Gerecke wished he could have been honest with him. Even Chaplain Karl Eggers, who had not known Goering for as long as Gerecke, called him a good-natured charmer with a good sense of humor. Eggers had been surprised that Goering also knew quite a bit about the Bible. Of all the doomed men, he impressed us the most, O'Connor said later. You felt that with his brain, he could have accomplished a lot. Well, I mean, technically he did.
Yeah. But what he means is accomplished a lot for good.
A lot of good.
Yeah.
But this is the point, is I have had personal interactions and engagements and experience with similar characters and personalities. I've sat with people who have killed, for example, and they're not dumb and they're not monstrous and they're very polite and they're very respectful of my office as pastor. But I also recognize in a different situation, this person is a lion. And you can pull out their claws and yank out their fangs. They're a lion. And if there was not the prison guards, and there was not bars, and there was not this table, and there was not handcuffs between us, maybe this respect would take a different turn.
Yeah. Well, it's not surprising then that Goering would be the smartest of the bunch. I mean, because he was the leader of the bunch.
Because he was the leader, exactly.
Yeah.
And so why was he, again, charismatic, smart, well-read, knowledgeable? Yeah.
Likeable.
I wonder why. And we've talked about this before, but all reforms are either moral reforms, apocalyptic reforms, or charismatic reforms. Luther was a charismatic reformer. He wasn't interested in, changing people's behavior in society like a moral reformer, like Erasmus would be. And he is apocalyptic because that was in the air. It was a part of the culture of his day.
That was partly Luther, but it was a lot his followers.
It was. And so Luther would say apocalyptic things, I think sometimes to be hyperbolic or just in exasperation. But he was primarily charismatic, meaning the power of his personality, the force of his personality is what really moved people.
Well, and it bound the movement together.
It really did. And so you see this then with a guy like Goering. He is proposing reform. Hitler is proposing reform. But what is it that wins people over? It's their charisma. Like we watch Hitler now in recordings from the Nuremberg rallies, or we can watch videos now with still photos of behind the scenes of him practicing his speeches in a mirror. And we can watch the Bundes rallies and say, well, he's certainly excitable and he's animated, but I don't get the appeal. Yeah, now we don't, because styles have changed and the public speaking kind of the rules of the rhetoric of public speaking may have changed. But in his day, he made people pass out from excitement.
Yeah, adrenaline rush.
It's like when we've read the kind of the born again preachers and these different born again movements, holiness movements, and these what do you call them?
Revivalists.
Thank you. Revivalists. I think we don't comprehend how a guy can stand on the back of a wagon and attract hundreds upon hundreds of people to leave their churches and join him. It's like, yeah, because what is that comparable to? Maybe Billy Graham in the present tense.
Yeah.
But even a guy like Joel Osteen or Rick Warren in the past or Rob Bell in the past, they lacked the kind of fiery charisma of a revivalist preacher or of a charismatic leader like a Luther or a Hitler or a Goering or others.
And yet they are charismatic,
yes.
But the style has changed.
Right. And they are in their moment, they comprehend society and how society ebbs and flows and the movements of society and the mechanisms behind the scenes that control things, whether it's the morality of the society or the fads or whatever, the fashions. And so we can look at that. For example, Hitler's mustache, which has always been made fun of. The reason that his mustache is that way is because he had a mustache and it kept messing up his gas mask.
Right.
So he shaved it down so that it would fit within his gas mask.
Whereas all the German soldiers had no facial hair.
Exactly. So we look at it and go, that's a silly mustache. But to everybody who served in the military, that's a sign of honor. That's a sign of he's been there. He's done that. We can trust this guy. He's fought. There you go. Just something simple like that. He understands. This is a symbol to people. This represents something.
Yeah.
Now, if it wasn't for Charlie Chaplin mocking Hitler in his film, The Great Dictator, then maybe, everything's different. But again, Charlie Chaplin being a satirist, being a comedian, recognizing this is a powerful symbol. I'm now going to take this symbol, I'm going to subvert it and turn it into something comical.
Right. Well, it's easy to do if you don't know the context.
Exactly. So he was likable. He was smart. He was charismatic. And with his brain, he could have accomplished a lot. So Goering had been fascinated with baseball, and he often discussed the game with O'Connor during routine visits. He wanted to know about the Dodgers and how baseball worked as a business. Is there money in it? Goering would ask. O'Connor told him that Branch Rickey, the Dodgers general manager, made $90,000 a year. Maybe I should have gone into that business, Goering had said. The World Series was on the radio that night, and Gerecke's St. Louis Cardinals were playing. In between visiting the prisoners in their cells, Gerecke and O'Connor hurried to the guard booth to get caught up on the score. There was $10 at stake between the two chaplains. This is interesting, that the little asides that O'Connor, for example, lied about the execution. Gerecke refused to talk about it, and they bet on the games, which Gerecke was an LCMS pastor, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking more conservative theology here, more conservative piety, socially conservative. So it's just interesting to me.
But you got your team, baseball.
I was going to say, how these two guys, this Roman Catholic and this Lutheran, bonded.
Well, they had to. I mean, you talk about the emotional strain of hearing these confessions, or even just having these conversations.
Well, there is that too, right? Conflict will make, again, in this book I'm reading right now by Parnell, Outlaw Platoon, you have a Satanist and a devout Christian who are friends because of the situation. It's like, we're being shot at every day. People are trying to kill us every day.
It's not setting aside our differences,
right?
But it's
recognizing that does not define us as human beings right now. Like, what defines us as human beings is that we're brothers, we're comrades in arms.
Yeah. Well, and like we read, I mean, O'Connor asked for Gerecke. He was familiar with him as a fellow Army chaplain,
right.
And needing a Protestant anyway.
Well, and I think this goes to Paul's point to Timothy, is to have a good reputation in your community. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you compromise your doctrine,
right? But
it does mean that you're not a jerk about it,
right? Well, and that you can have a comrade where there's a time where you can work together, and then maybe after this they had to go their ways, right? Stay in their own, spheres, their own worlds.
Yeah, stay in your lane.
Yeah. But here...
But at the same time, socially speaking, if we weren't here right now, maybe we would never talk to each other. Maybe if we were back in the United States in some semi-rural parish, we wouldn't be talking to each other because you're Roman and I'm Lutheran. But under these circumstances, we're all we've got.
Yeah.
And the outside world probably doesn't think too kindly of them either, especially the Roman Catholic priest.
Yeah, that comes up later in the reading here, so... That's the end of part one of what ended up being a 3-part series on this really excellent text from Tim Townsend describing Henry Gerecke's chaplaincy at the Nuremberg trials in Germany. So join us again later this week or next week or whenever it comes for part 2, and we'll see you then.